So recently I got a question about when is it appropriate to skip a checklist? Is it ever appropriate to train without checklists? And I decided while I was traveling in Chicago, I would just set up the camera. I was there at Jess's mom's house. Everybody was gone, and I had an opportunity to sort of speak my thoughts on that topic. This is part of a mail call podcast coming soon, but for now, it's exclusively here for you, the patrons. Check it out. Hello, aviators. I'm traveling here in Chicago. I thought this was a good time to sort of just set up a camera and record a podcast. I'm going to do another mail call episode here. I got a really interesting message on Facebook. Let me just go ahead and read this message to you if I can find it here. Okay, this is a long one. So this comes from a gentleman named Alan. Alan says, "Hi, Jason. I just listened to your podcast titled The Art of Instruction from April, where you mentioned going up on a checkout flight and observing someone not using a checklist until after landing. And this triggered a question in my head. Not sure if it's only me, or maybe the answer can be relevant to a wider audience as well. And my question is, does it ever make sense to fly without a checklist?" All right, so that's the question. I'm going to go on with this letter just a little bit. Alan goes on to say, I will add a little bit of background information as well to give you context about where I'm coming from with this. I am now a private pilot with a little over 80 hours of time in single engine, with the intention to end up with a commercial license one day. On the side, I am also working on a gliding license to make my experience more diversified. Now, I am doing my hour building while I also have been visiting several flight schools to decide where I would like to take my training for next modules. Multi-engine, IFR, commercial, and so on. So during my vacation from work, I visited a flight school in a different country in Europe with the intention to see and feel how it would be to study in that school with their instructors. Throughout my PPL training, I have always been taught to use checklists to make sure that critical elements have been covered during the flight. However, while taking some introduction flights with an instructor from the specified school that I visited, I was surprised to hear that they don't use checklists for primary training at all. I thought that maybe it was just a one instructor thing, but another student also confirmed that this is the way that it is done there. The student said that checklists are used later during instrument training. Yeah, so we're almost done with this. I'm just going to finish this letter. So to me, it felt a bit strange. This is Alan talking again. To me, it felt a bit strange to fly without a checklist. Of course, the flows should always be known and done by heart. And there certainly can be situations where you need to act fast and can't reach for a checklist. But I have also always thought of checklists as a crucial thing to use as a follow-up tool to make sure that nothing was missed. Maybe there are different schools of thought out there, and it can be considered okay to fly without one in some cases. I can understand the value in getting to know your aircraft intimately to the degree where you can perform all the tasks by heart without error, but does it justify removing one layer of extra safety as that a checklist can provide? All right. Anyway, best wishes, Alan from Estonia. All right, so this is a really, really interesting question, and it makes me think of, allow me just to tell you a brief story. When I first met my mentor, Richard, I got into the airplane. Now, keep in mind, I had been flying already as a private pilot for about 3 years when I met him. And I get into the aircraft, and I go to start. It's a Cessna 172, regular Cessna 172. It was not fuel injected. It was something I was familiar with. It was an N model with a plunger primer and something I should have known well. He grabs the checklist out of my hand and says, "Start the airplane." And I swear I felt a moment of panic. I thought, do I know how to do this? And Richard, as you've heard me mention in the past, was not the nicest person in the world. So immediately he starts ribbing me. You call yourself a private pilot. You've been flying for how long and you can't start this airplane? And immediately I just felt horrible and I realized, wow, he's really right. So the reason I'm telling you that story, not that eventually I hacked my way through the start, but I had been flying for 3 years. He was right. What was happening to me was I was reading this piece of paper. I was reading this list of due list items. Just, turn on the master, put the mixture rich, use the primer. and I wasn't engaging my brain. There was something about reading that list that turned off my ability to think critically about what I was doing. So through the course of working with Richard, he pointed out to me that there's essentially 3 things that go into an engine start. Make sure that the electrical equipment is off, prepare the fuel for starting, that is fuel tank on the right one or on both, mixture rich, prime it, however that occurs. Clear the prop area, turn on your master switch to bring power to your starter motor, turn on a beacon so the world knows you're doing it, and start the engine, right? It's not that complicated. So to Alan's question, is it ever appropriate to not use a checklist? And is there a value to doing this in primary training? And I think the value to not using a checklist in primary training, the one that this flight school is trying to get at and bring forth in the students, is the ability to think critically about what they're doing and to memorize flows that matter. So that when they are getting into the airplane, they're connected to it, they're doing the kinds of things that I just said. Is the electrical equipment off? Is the fuel prepared for start? Have I primed the motor? They're connected to the aircraft and actually learning what needs to be done. It's similar to what I require once the motor's running in my current training programs, that everything should have a flow or an acronym first, so that when we enter a climb, there's a flow check that verifies, is the heading correct? Is it set to the magnetic compass? Are my lights where I want them? Is the engine running well? Is power set where I want it? If there's cowl flaps, are they open? The issue that I have is the same as the one Alan brought up here, is why not have that second layer of redundancy built into the initial training program? Because the law of primacy says the way you do it initially, the way you learn it the first time, is the way that you're going to tend to do it over time, particularly when you get stressed. And if you look at any respectable single pilot program in the professional world, a 135 cargo operator, somebody like Ameriflight or whatever, they have their pilots doing flow checks and acronyms, but it's always backed up with a checklist, because the way that those companies can achieve the outstanding safety records that they have is to build in some redundant mechanism into a single pilot world. I often tell pilots that finding redundancy in a single pilot world is like finding water in the desert. You have to be a camel. You have to pack it away. You have to look for it wherever you can. You have to wring it out of the cactus. You have to, find it where it essentially doesn't exist. So I do think there's value in not using a checklist as a do list. There is a value in plugging in your brain and using critical thinking as you fly the aircraft. But I would not, especially initially, skip the step of having a redundant backup in the single pilot world. So having some piece of paper you look at. And it's almost arbitrary. I can tell you right now that the climb checklist for the Cessna 172 says, 75 to 85 knots in the climb, power full, mixture rich, engine gauges look good, heading indicator set to the magnetic compass. Does that mean I don't look at the piece of paper when I fly? Of course not. I absolutely look at the piece of paper, because the training is for me to stay standard. The procedure is mine. If I go fly a TBM, I want to make sure that my primacy is looking at a piece of paper after I make those flow checks. So that's a very interesting question. Just remember, the redundancy goes with you. It doesn't matter so much what the piece of paper says. It is actually the specific act of checking something, looking at some other piece of paper, because you won't always be flying the Cessna 172 that they're using in primary training. But if your primacy is to skip looking at checklists, then that is not a good foundation to set up. It's also not a good foundation to set up to simply use the checklist as a do list. So the spirit of what that school is going for has some value for sure. But I don't see the value in skipping the redundant checks that a professional company like a cargo operator or any other single pilot operation is going to force you to comply with. That is the safest and most bulletproof way to fly. I want my students doing flow checks first and checklists second, or GUMPS checks first and checklists second. Once the motor is running, everything in the single pilot world should be redundant. So awesome question, Alan. Thank you so much. And I do think there's a big value in, going to the school that you're talking about there. Just make sure you are using a checklist after you do the things they want you to with the flow check. That's an important piece of primacy to stick with. Great question, though. Thank you.